Saudara, tensi konflik Rusia Ukraina terus memanas hingga hari ini. Sejak Rusia melakukan agresi militer di Ukraina lebih dari sepekan terakhir. And we will talk about the escalation of Russia and Ukraine conflict into war from the Russian perspective. Joining us, Russian Ambassador to Indonesia, Her Excellency Ambassador Lyudmila Georgievna Vorobieva. Madam Ambassador, thank you for your willingness to join this special interview with Kompas TV.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really nice to see you. Your Excellency, first of all, I'd like to ask your thoughts about what President Putin of Russia has said once. If this depends on Russia, there will be no war. But why is the conflict escalating into a military aggression in Ukraine?
Well, I would repeat that because Russia doesn't want war. And once again, I would like to stress that we are not conducting a war against Ukrainian people who we consider as brothers and sisters. We're of the same culture, we are of the same roots, we are even related closely. There are mixed marriages. Many Ukrainians are living in Russia, and around 40% of Ukrainian population are ethnic Russians, or people who think of themselves as Russian and speak Russian language. Well, all Ukrainians speak Russian language. So we are not conducting a war against Ukrainians, and our Ministry of Defense has stated many times that we're targeting just a military installation in Ukraine, and we're sparing the civil population. We're doing whatever we can not to target any civilians, and we're trying to ensure that they are safe and secure. You cannot understand what is happening now without looking at the background, at the history of what has been happening on. And of course, the root cause of this crisis, it's the years-long sabotage by Kiev of the so-called Minsk agreements package. For 8 years now, the present government of Kiev, who came to power as a result of a coup d'etat, a legitimate and very bloody coup d'etat in Kiev, has been conducting a war actually against their own population because they consider Lugansk and Donetsk to be part of Ukraine, and until recently we also considered it to be a part of Ukraine, and indeed it was a civil war. Do you know the numbers of people who died in Lugansk and Donetsk? In these 8 years, now there's a lot of cries in the Western media that we are killing Ukrainians, but we are not killing Ukrainians. But where was the Western media when the Ukrainian army was killing people in Donetsk and Lugansk? There are different estimates of how many people died there in these 8 years. The lowest one is 2,500, the highest one is 16,000. But anyway, it means that every single day, people were dying there. And the Ukrainian armed forces were shelling the civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, bridges, etc., etc. So that lasted for too long. I would also like to stress that Russia, these 8 years, tried to find a peaceful solution of this conflict, a diplomatic way to solve it. For 8 years, we've initiated the Minsk agreements, which provided a clear way to solve this conflict inside Ukraine, because at that time it was a civil war between Ukrainians, actually, because the people of Lugansk and Donetsk, they were Ukrainian nationals, considered by Kiev as such. So, the agreements that were signed with the support of the Western powers and Russia, of course, provided the way to find a solution. For instance, to, first of all, stop the armed military conflict there, and to provide Donetsk and Lugansk with a special autonomous status. Kiev signed these agreements. They committed, but they didn't do anything. And we were always accused, Russia was always accused that we don't fulfill the Minsk agreements while we were not part of the Minsk agreements. So for 8 years, we have been pushing Kiev to commit to their obligations under the Minsk agreements. We were talking to our Western partners in order for them to push Kiev to commit to this obligation, but nothing happened. People continued to die in these regions. The war was going on. And meanwhile, after 2014, the West was turning Ukraine and its puppet government into what our president called an anti-Russia. They pumped military equipment into Ukraine. They trained their armed forces. They brainwashed Ukrainians in believing that Russia is their enemy. They supported the Nazi ideology that is very widespread in Ukraine and supported by the government. If you think about it, how could it be really, that Nazi ideology, which was the ideology of Nazi Germany during World War II, is condemned all over the world and is banned in Europe, in Russia, in the United States, and in Ukraine. The government supported it, and the West turned a blind eye to that. But it's not only ideology; it was a physical threat to all Russians living in Ukraine. Just for speaking Russian, you could have been beaten up or thrown out from your working place. And we know many cases, hundreds or even thousand cases like that. So Ukraine was turned into a political and military instrument against Russia. And if you look even longer back, you know that we, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we agreed with the Western powers that NATO will not expand eastward to our borders. Our leaders then actually suggested that there would be a written agreement that NATO will not expand. Why should NATO expand? There were no more ideological differences between Russia and the West. We were not considered as enemy. So why would NATO expand? So our leaders proposed to have an agreement, but the Western leaders said, no, you just believe us. Just take us your word. Our word for that. We believed them. They lied. From 1999 to 2020, there were 5 rounds of expansions of NATO towards Russia. And if people don't understand why we were so much against it, you need to consider that NATO is not a defense pact. It's quite an aggressive pact. Do you remember what they did in Yugoslavia? Do you remember what they did in Libya, in Iraq, what the Americans did in Afghanistan? Couldn't we feel threatened? But we were, just trying to use diplomatic efforts and means, trying to convince them to also to fulfill their obligation. It never happened. But as our president put it, we have our red lines, and the red lines is for Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. We have a long border with Ukraine. If the NATO defense, I can say defense, military infrastructure comes to Ukraine, it will be right at our borders with this country. And it's a direct threat to the security of the Russian Federation. And again, for this 8 years, NATO, led by the US, were turning Ukraine into a political and military instrument to attack Russia in all possible ways. So if you want to blame someone for what is happening in Ukraine now, you should first of all blame the West and the collective West, as we say, and Kiev, who, of course, the government in Kiev was never independent in the real sense of this word. They followed the orders from Washington and Brussels, and they actually put Ukrainian people as hostages of their I would say criminal policies. So the tension were escalating. In December last year, we extended a hand again to NATO and to US. We proposed to sign an agreement with them and to provide security guarantees for Russia.
Okay.
They didn't respond to that. So. And at the same time, there was a lot of Ukrainian troops amassing at the borders of Lugansk and Donetsk, and they started to escalate the shelling, the bombing, the armed actions against the people of Lugansk and Donetsk. So finally, we exhausted all diplomatic, peaceful means to solve, to prevent people from dying, actually.
Okay.
So that's why this decision was taken. And as I said, again, it's not a war against Ukraine. It's not a war against Ukrainian people. It's a special military operation to protect people of Lugansk and Donetsk, and at the end to protect Russia, because what our president said, that the target of this operation is to demilitarize and to denazify Ukraine.
Last Wednesday, the UN General Assembly demanded on Russia to end the military operations immediately by withdrawing the military forces in Ukraine. According to your statement, will it be possible to do?
Well, we really hope that the military operation will be ended as soon as possible, because we don't want people to suffer. It's the least of our intention. But it will be possible to end it only if our target is achieved, be it by diplomatic ways. We're engaged with talks with the Ukrainian side, or with through the military operation. And the targets are very clear: to demilitarize, to denazify Ukraine, so that Ukraine becomes a neutral country. We want to live in peace with Ukrainians, our neighbors and brothers and sisters. We're sick and tired of this aggressive stance of the government of Kiev and the West supported. Actually, they were pushed by the West into this situation. As for the General Assembly resolution, we, of course, there's a lot of pressure from our Western, so to say, partners on other countries. We know that this happened. They did everything they could to make the countries vote as they did. But also, I understand very well the emotional reaction of a normal person to the world war, to the word war. You don't want war. Not a single normal person would want war. And the West is playing on these sentiments because for many countries who are not very much involved into European politics, they really don't understand what was happening during this. And of course, all the information about what was happening in Lugansk and Donetsk was blocked from the Western mainstream media. So again, we really hope that the operation will end soon, that the civilian population in Ukraine will not suffer.
About the talks between two countries, the second round of Russia and Ukraine talk ended with neither breakthrough nor ceasefire agreement. So will the peace agreement still possible to do? And what condition that will end the military operation in Ukraine?
Well, I don't have the details of the talks, but I wouldn't say that they were useless or hopeless, because the parties agreed to have a third round of talks. And they will start early next week, according to the statement given by the delegations. And the details are not disclosed, but again, from the statements from the delegation, there were some points identified that could serve as a basis for finding solutions to this crisis. And also the topic of the talks is actually the ceasefire. So the talks will be going on. As our minister said, we are quite sure that we will find a solution to this crisis.
But speaking about the destruction of a number of public facilities in Ukraine, such as apartments, schools, hospitals, and others, we'd like to clarify, is it true that Russia also targeting and expanding the operation to civilians or not?
No, it's absolutely not true. If you have followed the statements by our Ministry of Defense, we are not targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. In any city that is surrounded by the troops of Lugansk and Donetsk republics or Russian armed forces, there's always a humanitarian passage open for all those who want to get away, that they could do so in a safe way. If you look at what is terrible, actually, all this fake information in the media, when they show the images of what Ukrainian army did in Lugansk and Donetsk, and they were hitting the civilian infrastructure, and they say it is the Russian army, results of the Russian armed actions in Ukraine. So this is a total. It's not even an information war against Russia. It's a information terrorism against Russia. When there was targets in Kiev hit by the precise, we call it precise with the precise strokes of Russian arms, all the civilians living around this installations were told in advance not to stay near these places. And we are not bombing civilian installations. It's so cynical when those people who bombed Yugoslavia in 1999 for 78 days, bombing civilians, bombing schools, bombing hospitals, with carpet bombings, using bombs with depleted uranium, which cause not only death, but in a long run, they cause cancer in the population. Now they're saying that we are doing something barbaric in Ukraine. It's so cynical, and it's absolutely untrue.
And about today, the US, EU, UK, and many other countries have imposed economic sanctions. Most recently, some Russian banks were removed from the international financial system, SWIFT. Thus, the transactions became more difficult. So how did Russia handle this situation?
Well, first of all, I would like to say it's an absolutely hysterical response from the West. It's as also our minister put it, they just lost control. Have you, also, do you remember what NATO did in Iraq? Do you remember what NATO did in Libya? They destroyed the country. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan. They tried to do it in Syria. Where were this hysterical reaction by the international community? I'm not telling that we want to follow these very bad examples, but still. So this reaction is absolutely hysterical. Our economy is quite resilient. I will not say that it doesn't hurt. Of course it hurts. And of course it doesn't make life of people better, but they're also in this hysterical reaction, they are shooting themselves in the leg, because Russia is a part of the global economy. We are supplying we're supplying oil and gas to Europe. You see what is happening with the oil and gas prices right now. I can tell you it's not the first time that they are imposing sanctions against us. It started in 2014. Our economy has adapted. Of course, we would wish to avoid that, but I really hope that finally, and I'm sure that Russia will survive, and the targets that we have in Ukraine will be achieved. And the main target, is to live in peace with Ukraine and not to feel threatened by Ukraine, by the West, or by any other party.
Madam Ambassador, how does Russia see about the Indonesia statement from President Joko Widodo last February? Let me quote Mr. President Jokowi's statement: "Stop the war. War brings misery to mankind and puts the whole world at risk." What do you think about it?
Well, I cannot agree more with the president of Indonesia that, of course, war is a tragedy, and Russia, better than many other countries, knows that we suffered a lot during World War I, World War II. We know what war is, but I think this statement should be addressed, first of all, to the Western countries and Kiev that have been conducting the war in Lugansk and Donetsk for 8 years, and those who have been initiating and trying to push Ukraine into war with Russia.
What does Russia expect from the countries in global communities, and also Indonesia, particularly regarding the Russia-Ukraine war today?
We see Indonesia as our good partner and friend. We have many good friends and partners in the world. The West and US is not the whole world. And many countries did not join the sanctions or didn't condemn the so-called Russian aggression. I would like to wish for all our friends not to surrender to emotions, but to, as I said, it's a normal reaction of a person to be horrified by the word war. But I would like people to know what was behind these actions of the Russian Federation, and to understand that we don't want war. At the end, we're not launching a war, we're putting an end to this war.
Is the aggression, today's aggression, is the only way to solve the tension? And when will the military operation or Russia-Ukraine war end?
It's not an aggression, it's a response to aggressive actions of Kiev and the West. And I'm not the military expert, I cannot tell you when exactly it will end, but our hope, and that's the hope of the Russian leadership, Russian government, Russian people, that it will end as soon as possible. And that there will be minimum casualties among Ukrainians. Actually, the term collateral damage, if you remember, was not invented by Russia. It was invented by the US, that conducted, how many? 27, to use this term, aggressions against sovereign country after World War II. So, but not unless we achieve our target of having peaceful, demilitarized, and denazified Ukraine.
Madam Ambassador, I really hope the conflict will be resolved as soon as possible to prevent more casualties, to prevent more victims in this war. Your Excellency, thank you so much for sharing the Russian point of view in this special interview with Kompas TV. Russian Ambassador to Indonesia, Her Excellency Ambassador Lyudmila Georgievna Vorobieva. Thank you.
Thank you so much.